From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so excited to see so many folks here this afternoon. Thank you for coming. We're so glad that you could come and spend some time with us this afternoon. My name is Jane Sanchez. I'm the Chief of Humanities and Social Sciences Division here at the library. On behalf of our division and the Library of Congress, I welcome everyone to this afternoon's talk by Dr. Jessica Millward. The lecture today is part of our ongoing series of programs in the humanities and social sciences. Today's program interprets and promotes an awareness of the library's unique African American collections. Other recent examples of such programs include a full-day Juneteenth Book Festival Symposium entitled Celebrating African American Literature, Literacy, and Independent Artists, which featured Dr. Haki Mahabuti, founder and publisher of the Third World Press, and several other outstanding activists, literary activists. The panel discussing Remembering Edward William Brooks, 1919 to 2015. It also included a lecture and book signing, Living with Lynching, African American Lynching Plays, Performance and Citizenship, 1890 to 1930, by Dr. Coritha Mitchell of Ohio State University, and a lecture and book signing for the Segregated Scholars, Black Social Scientists and the Creation of Black Labor Studies, 1890 to 1950, by Dr. Francille Rusin Wilson at the University of Maryland, who is also the current president of the Association of Black Women Historians. A number of staff members have been involved in planning our programs, and I'd like to just take a moment to thank them for today's event. Dr. Sybil Moses for suggesting Dr. Millward as a speaker, Leroy Bell and Darren Jones of HSS for their assistance, Wallace Perry, Office of Business Enterprises, and Nichelle Wingfield, Office of Special Programs and Public Programs. And now, to introduce Dr. Millward, Dr. Sybil Moses, Reference Specialist for African American History and Culture.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for your support and your interest. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jessica Millward, Associate Professor of History at the University of California, Irvine, and author of Finding Charity's Folk, Enslaved and Free Black Women in Maryland. Can we imagine what life would have been like for enslaved women of African descent in the 19th century of Maryland? Will we ever be able to calculate the number of enslaved Black women who have been lost to history? These are the concerns that our historian scholar has addressed. Today, Dr. Jessica Millward will share her research and her inspiring story of uncovering, capturing, and preserving the life and experiences of Charity Folks, an enslaved woman from Annapolis, Maryland, and the multiple generations of folk or descendants of Charity Folks. Using personal accounts, oral history, photographs, artifacts, and several Library of Congress collections, as well as collections in other repositories, Dr. Millward shows us in her own words how enslaved women moved across and beyond the boundaries between slavery and freedom, and ultimately changed those boundaries. And the three words that she features in her epilogue are faith, hope, and love as the means by which they overcame. And for those of us who are familiar with even African American history today, we know that that is what is sustaining us: faith, hope, and love. Dr. Millward is the recipient of several awards and fellowships, including the Association of Black Women Historians Letitia Woods Brown Best Article in Black Women's History Prize. Following this presentation, Dr. Millward has agreed to answer a few questions, and then please note that we are recording this presentation for the Library of Congress's website, and any questions asked constitute your permission to be recorded. Thank you. So we are honored to host Dr. Millward at the Library of Congress, so please join me in welcoming her to the podium.
Okay, normally I would ask if you can hear me, but I guess I'll ask, can you see me? I'm a bit... I want to thank you all so much for coming out. This is, in some ways, it's a homecoming and a reunion because I lived in DC for 3 years while I was doing dissertation research. So I might be having a little feelings this morning. This is a bad time for it to hit me, but I'll work through it. So thank you to all of those who made me feel very welcome today, especially to the Humanities and Social Sciences Division. Thank you to Chief Sanchez, and I especially want to thank Dr. Sybil Moses. Dr. Moses has been my liaison, and she is my host today. She moved literally heaven and earth so that this talk could take place during Black History Month. This included and was not limited to processing every item that is needed for a talk in a federal space, meaning everything had to go through 3 levels of clearance or more, and they had to go through very quickly. So I do want to give a heartfelt thank you to her. A special acknowledgement to the archivists and reference librarians in the main reading room, the manuscript room, the newspaper room, photographs, and prints. I spent a great deal of time in each of these rooms researching these projects. And also I want to thank all of you who came today. I mean, some of you literally were sitting at the table with me when I started this project. And so it's nice to see so many of you, and especially to those of you that brought your students so you can help educate a new generation. So today's talk, Finding Charity's Folks, Public Memory, and the Instruction and the Construction of an Enslaved Biography, is a play obviously on the title of my recently released book. Charity Folks is a formerly enslaved woman who lived in Annapolis, Maryland during the time of the American Revolution. The book uses the fragmented archive of Charity Folks' life to give a window into the ways that slavery, freedom, and liberation were intertwined in the lives of African American women. In particular, as Dr. Moses said, it explores how enslaved women moved across and beyond the boundaries of slavery and freedom, and ultimately changed those boundaries. In the decades following the American Revolution, enslaved women such as Charity Folks acquired freedom by buying it, by being granted it, by petitioning it, and then, of course, by negotiating for it privately. By accessing manumission, or that is the act to be free, freedom by a legal deed, enslaved women, as I said, shifted the boundaries of freedom in terms of the law, their communities, their family, their work, and even their own bodies. Maryland may have been typical in the 1880s. It was typical because it had a large free Black population. And this tended to happen in places like Virginia, in places like South Carolina, where there was an urban center, number one, and number two, where slavery was no longer profitable. Maryland in particular shifted from tobacco production to wheat production, and that doesn't necessarily mean that one needed a labor force for the entire year. So planters were able to relieve themselves of enslaved property by either hiring them out or freeing them. But freedom came with some kind of stipulation, which I'll discuss in a moment. So when I looked at this larger project, its genesis actually happened to be in questions of motherhood, resistance, and slavery. And so I opened the book with this very first line: motherhood during slavery was the farthest thing from freedom. For enslaved African American women, freedom, like enslavement, was actually tied to the womb. Enslaved women, particularly in Maryland, realized that if they could give birth to an enslaved child, they also, because of how the law was structured, could give birth to a free child. Meaning, because the way the laws were structured, and because slaveholders were freeing their slaves in greater numbers, if the status of a child was written down in a document before the mother gave birth, in theory, if the owner said they were going to free that child, the child could be born free. Well, we know that this didn't always happen. But for the most part, Maryland is unique because there's this notion that as the law was changing, particularly in 1808, enslaved women actually had this thought that perhaps they could give birth to free children. So the gendering of freedom influenced notions of liberty, equality, and race in what becomes this new nation. And this gendering of freedom also held long-term implications for African American women's interactions in the state, which hopefully we can get to. While a singular definition of freedom or its manifestations is not really possible because the conditions and experiences of enslavement were not uniform, this study focuses chiefly on two aspects of how enslaved people defined freedom. So in the book, I talk about the historical groundings of enslaved women trying to lobby for their own freedom, either negotiating with their owners or filing petitions and what have you. I don't want to say the greater story, but the story you're here today to hear is how, in fact, families influence the writing of history, and history influences the writing of families, okay? So with that said, in this talk, Charity Folks, she appears as a ghost who haunts public memory. She appears as an embodied subject. She appears as a founding mother, and she appears as a forgotten ancestor. So my final thank you this morning is to Charity Folks, who has waited a long time to have her story reclaimed. Charity Folks is a ghost of slavery who refuses to be silenced. She finds herself in the company of Margaret Garner's beloved daughter, the young girl known only as Celia Enslaved, Sarah Bartman, Sally Hemings, Sojourner Truth, Queen Nanny of the Maroons, and countless unnamed women who haunt historical memory precisely because they carry the weight of the diaspora's traumatic past. Collectively and individually, their lives testify to the multifaceted legacies of enslavement and attempts by captives to dismantle it. And they do so without suppressing the slave system's most violent and horrific truths. The recovered past of Black women underscore the competing interests involved in remembering, constructing, and commemorating their lives. So Charity Folks isn't as well known as these other women, but she is no less important. She was enslaved in Annapolis, Maryland, and she gained her freedom as an adult. We know from an 1811 freedom certificate she was, quote, bright mulatto and about 52 years old, suggesting she was born around 1759. One local historian suggests that she was born at Bel Air Plantation, which is actually 10 minutes outside of Annapolis. Oops. Okay, we're going to wait. Just wait. It happens all the time. And what can be deduced from her life is that she probably worked in the home, in the domestic space, and she lived with, at least initially at Bel Air Plantation, she lived with her mother and her brother. Charity Folks gave birth to 5 children, all of whom gained their freedom, and her family line produced generations of race men and race women committed to uplifting African Americans. Among her descendants are some of the most accomplished African American families of the 19th and 20th century. During the 19th century, members of her family were prominent in the free Black class in Annapolis and Baltimore. They served as pillars of the Methodist and Episcopal Church. They even fought in the Civil War. Rather, one was on a Navy ship during the Civil War. During the 20th century, her descendants, who were named the bishops, became pioneers in the fields of medicine, religion, and participated in the ongoing struggle for Black equality in America. So I first encountered Charity Folks in the year 2000 while I was conducting research, dissertation research, which was supposed to be on freedom and slavery in Anne Arundel and Baltimore counties. She introduced herself through manumission documents executed by her owners in 1797 and 1807. And these deeds revealed that Charity had arranged to secure not only her freedom, but for her children and her grandchildren as well. Thus, more than 50 years before the Emancipation Proclamation, I found an enslaved woman who was the architect of her own liberation. Charity's name and fragments of her story quickly became the focus of a dissertation chapter, a book, and an article. Charity Folks worked her way literally into every single conference paper and article I tried to write. And if I did not include her name, the article wouldn't be published, the paper didn't go well, so she literally worked her way into every project I was doing. And I don't know if, is Dr. Brown arrived yet? I don't think Dr. Brown is here. So people would often ask in sustained disbelief, Charity Folks, is she still around? Indeed, Charity was present and she was unshakable. And one of my colleagues, I see my colleague Damian Thomas here, one of our colleagues at Illinois said, wouldn't it be great if you found more information on Charity folks? Wouldn't it be great if you told the book from her perspective? And I said, yeah, that's not going to happen. At that point, I had two documents. I will say for the record that Professor David Roediger was right. It was really great to tell this book from her perspective. But that forced me to do a lot of things in order to take two documents and make a book. So that my search for Charity folks has spanned more than a decade. Like I said, she found herself in her way into every conversation. I've cataloged more than 1,500 manumission documents to see if her history was typical or if it was exceptional. I conducted work on 3 continents, the United States, Great Britain, and in Ghana. And one of the most important things that happened in this finding Charity folks is I actually realized I possessed a bulk of the information about her life, and I had for some time. But that was only revealed when I listened to the silences. And sometimes we know, for doing the kind of work that some of us do, looking for people who weren't meant to be in historical documents, doing this kind of research revolves around not just looking at how history is documented, but how it is remembered, and in most cases, how it is imagined. I did a considerable amount of work to step outside of the archive, to chase after this ghost that was chasing me. And the first thing I did is I called the Historic Annapolis Foundation. And there, a gentleman by the name of Glenn Campbell answered the phone and said, "Oh, Charity. I don't know anything about her, but I know she's important." So that sent me on this trail. I met Janice Hayes Williams, who is a local genealogist and local historian. She assured me the story of Charity folks didn't end with the 2 documents that I had. I was encouraged to speak to the descendants of the people who owned Charity folks, who was the Right Out family. And the Right Out family is very prominent in the state of Maryland. And they actually have a history and a connection to Kunta Kinte, the ancestor that is talked about in Alex Haley's book. And when we can discuss how legitimate or non-legitimate that is. The point of the matter is the Right Out family is very used to people calling them and saying, "I'm sorry, may I talk to you about the enslaved people your family used to own?" So it wasn't as awkward as it initially was going to be. And I also contacted descendants of Charity folks, which I will talk about in the latter part of this talk. So without a picture to guide me, well, let me back up. When we think about the history of slavery in Maryland, we really only think about 3 people. We think about Kunta Kinte, who I just named. We think about Frederick Douglass, and we think about Harriet Tubman. And this is one of the reasons that Charity folks has remained such an obscure historical figure. We know that Annapolis hardly ever receives attention by historians. People are much more interested in Baltimore. And we know that when people are telling stories and recreating movies, we know the story of Harriet Tubman or Kunta Kinte or Frederick Douglass is much more exciting. So there are a couple of places in Maryland where there are actually monuments and exhibits dedicated to these 3 individuals. We have in the upper corner the house that Frederick Douglass worked in and lived in when he was enslaved in Fells Point. There's another bust commemorating his head. We have Harriet Tubman down here. And then we have the Alex Haley Museum memorial that sits on the dock of Annapolis. What is interesting about this is even though there are all these plaques and that we can take plaques and monuments and we can take a tour for $18 and walk around Frederick Douglass's Baltimore, what is interesting is just as Baltimore belonged to Frederick Douglass, Annapolis certainly belonged to Charity folks. Charity folks is more representative of the enslaved experience in Maryland than Kunta Kinte, Frederick Douglass, or Harriet Tubman, and this is why. She did not flee bondage like Frederick Douglass or Harriet Tubman. She did not die enslaved like Kunta Kinte, nor did she end her life in poverty. Okay? Folks in her family were like the 45,000 other enslaved people in Maryland who gained their freedom in the decades following the American Revolution. So in Maryland, this small geographic region boasted a remarkably fluid, slaved, and free black population. Folks lived the majority of her life in the Chesapeake, and during her lifetime, she inhabited all 3 zones of freedom. Okay, so as I said, I had to go on an expedition. I had to go on an expedition. I literally, sorry, I know we're being recorded, so I guess I won't walk around. So, without a picture, we don't have a picture of what Charity Folks looks like. Without a picture, I was literally forced to go to the site where she lived and literally consider myself an archaeologist and look for places where I thought her imprint might be visible. So this is a map sitting just offside of Church Circle. You can see Doctor Street, you can see South Street. Charity Folks, during her grown adult years, inhabited these, 3 blocks that adjoin one another. That was it. She was enslaved at the bottom of this, the bottom of what I'm saying right here, Doctor Street. She moved to the corner of South Street when she was freed. So her entire life was contained in this area. However, it's much more interesting than you would expect. Charity Folks' imprint is all over Annapolis. Nearly every place she worked in that she inhabited is part of Historic Annapolis or part of the National Historic Trust. Properties once owned by Charity Folks and her son-in-law are sites for archaeological digs and continue to yield crucial details about Black Annapolis. Now, during the late 19th century, Folks' property at 84 Franklin Street was sold to the Mount Moriah African Methodist Episcopal Church as the site of their new building. The church has since came into the hands of the National Historic Trust, and it's been converted to the Banneker Douglas Museum, which is Maryland's official repository for African American heritage. And this is where I'll do a shameless plug and say we have 2 representatives from the Banneker Douglas Museum. We are actually working on an exhibit around this story for next year, so welcome them. And I also learned that going through this that not only was Charity Folks' imprint visible, but she was integral to the history of Annapolis, which means I also had to accept that there were public narratives about her life that may or may not agree with the documents. This put me out of favor with some people. I think we've come to a conclusion, but it was very awkward to have to write a history as a historian and be challenged by people who had passed down a history for generations. So Charity does not enter the historical record until she's an adult. As I said before, one local historian thinks that she was born at Bel Air Plantation, which is now part of this City of Bowie museums. We don't have any documentation for this, but it's alluded to in family lore. It's alluded to in several places. Okay. The slave quarters of Bel Air have not survived, but the public display at the mansion suggests that the enslaved people made their home in the cellar of this grand mansion. They lived among rats and mice and horses. They lived as chattel. Charity may have spent the first 10 to 12 years of her life, like I said, in the cellar with her brother James and her mother. Or she might have lived in Annapolis. We're really unclear. We do know that she entered the house of John Right Out between 1765 and 1767, but it's unclear how she ended up there too. Some say that she was part of a dowry. When Samuel Ogle, who owned Bel Air Mansion, who was the governor of Maryland, his daughter actually married John Right Out. So this brings us to the Right Outhouse. Some of these pictures are actually from the Library of Congress. The John Right Outhouse stands on Gloucester Street in Annapolis, and it is a historical monument and testament to 18th century architecture. So this is the frontispiece of the house. You can see the little historical landmark marking, picture from the Library of Congress. I've been in the house. The house almost looks just like this picture that was taken in the 40s or 50s. This is an outside view of the house, and then the house from the back. So Charity Folks probably came to the Right Outhouse when she was about 13 years of age. And we don't know what kind of advice her mother would have given her. We don't know if she had a chance to say goodbye to her mother, but she comes to the Right Outhouse right when she's on the cusp of puberty, in a house with a mistress she knew because she was raised at Bel Air with Mary Right Out, we're told, and she was also placed in a house with a master, John Right Out, that she did not know. So we're not really sure what her experiences would have been like. Was she free from sexual violation? Did she come in close contact with people? Was she punished often? We don't know this. But living outside the normative definition of womanhood probably forced enslaved women like Charity to nurture her spirit in a particular way to combat the psychological and physical damage, physical abuse that encircled her life. We know that while she was enslaved, Charity gave birth to 5 children and maintained a broad relationship with another slave named Thomas Folks, meaning he lived a few doors down. He was owned by John Davidson, a shopkeeper and tavern owner, and from what we know, he fathered 3 of her 5 children. Whereas Charity was determined to influence her own liberation, it's clear that the decision to actually manumit her took place over quite a few decades. In total, it took almost 40 years from the time that Charity's first daughter was freed by John Right Out to the time that her grandchildren were finally freed. It took 40 years for this entire family to live as free people. For Charity Folks in particular, she died in John Right Out died in 1797, and within 2 months, his wife signed a deed to grant Charity Folks freedom. And at this point, 2 of Charity's daughters were already freed, and they lived with her mother or her free black husband. Thomas Folks has been freed. And Charity Folks still had children remaining in bondage. So I'm going to short shift so we can get to questions and answers and basically say that by 1807, all of her children were freed. And by 1810, we can tell that she's living in a house with Thomas Folks and her children. Despite Charity Folks' desire to keep members of her family close, their experiences in slavery continued to drive a wedge between them. And ultimately, the fact that some were freed and others stayed in bondage actually produced resentment among her children. Her son, for example, felt that she had a greater fondness for her little daughter named Little Charity than she did for the other children in the family. And this often frustrated her husband, who by now was free, and he remarked that Little Charity's influence would actually carry his wife to hell. For their part, James Jackson, her son, and her other daughter, Mary Folks, certainly believed that they were unfairly separated from their mother when they were young, and they felt that because Charity was probably the one that stayed with her the longest, that she had the better relationship. And so this produces a long-standing rivalry between Mary Folks and Little Charity. The rivalry was so intense that they actually sued one another. Mary Folks and her husband sued Charity Folks Bishop and her husband William Bishop because the bishops erected a fence that would not allow them to cross the alley and go to their own home. So when it came down to it, the 2 sisters were competing literally over a space that was 18 inches long. Who owned it, who was it bequeathed to, what have you. So this rivalry was intense. And this tension exacerbated in the family even more when William Bishop and his wife Charity Bishop, Little Charity, moved into the house with Charity Folks. In fact, Little Charity asked her brother James Jackson to remove the pigs that he kept in the front yard. And this ensued such a violent argument that James drew a knife on his mother and called her ill names. Charity Folks never forgave her son, and she was removed from her will. And that was a significant penalty because she really amassed a lot of property. In addition to the lingering memories of slavery in her home, the imprint of slavery was still apparent all over Annapolis. A perfect example is if we go to Annapolis now, you can go to Reynolds Tavern, you can go there for high tea. I'm the scholar of slavery. I should have known this. I went to Reynolds Tavern for high tea. Thomas Folks had worked there when he became free. And then the local historian said, we don't go to Reynolds Tavern. We don't? We don't go to Reynolds Tavern because during the slave trade, they sold people in the parlor room. And archaeological evidence from Mark Leone at the University of Maryland College Park reveals they actually held people in the basement waiting to be sold. So this imprint of slavery even exists today, but at the time that Charity was a free person, this building was right across the street from her home. So slavery is still everywhere, right? In a form of eerie foreshadowing, Charity Folks anticipated being lost from history. In her final years, she felt she was displaced and feared being turned out of doors. She obsessively searched for something that was lost, and half the time she did not know what she was looking for. Family members and neighbors described her as deranged. And given her age and her failing health and probably the experiences she endured, it's probably not surprising that folks probably had something that likened to dementia. Now, part of her rootlessness and restlessness in her later years stemmed from a sense that her position in the family was being overtaken, that her son-in-law, William Bishop, was displacing her as the mistress of the house. Bishop ultimately assumed control of her residence and eventually the deed to the property, substantiating folks' worst fear that she was losing power among her kin. A family friend described a fight between William Bishop and Charity Folks, and the family friend remarked that there was just no place for her, and she set off to the graveyard. This was the last public account documenting the life of Charity Folks. Charity Folks, we know, suffered a paralyzing stroke in 1834 when she was 75. She regained the ability to walk and some ability to speak, but she died within that year. Charity Folks did leave a will at a time when white men failed to even use this legal mechanism. Her will and its related codicils underscore the importance she attached to property and kin alike. She left property to each of her three surviving daughters. And folks, in some ways, resembled African Americans during Reconstruction, which is discussed by Dylan Penningroth, in that her family, in the like many 19th century African Americans, Charity Folks attached value to reclaiming her family members, even though they had been lost to slavery. And in essence, her kin was as valuable as property. She also had a clear understanding of what it took to succeed in a free society and worked hard to become a woman of property and social standing. Though she was not formally educated, Charity learned legal protocol from life experiences and her exposure to business transactions. A family genealogical chart bears the notation that Charity Folks, the wife of Thomas, personal maid to the wife of the governor, is buried in St. Anne's Cemetery in Annapolis. Tucked away between the Severn River and Route 50, St. Anne connects historic Annapolis with the modern world, and it contains graves spanning back 200 years of the city's history. And there's a Bishop family plot where 12 members of the Bishop and Folks family are buried. Next to a headstone for Thomas Folks, which is the one closest to me, there's an empty space. And there's a footstone at the end of this that you'll see in a moment. So it's Thomas Folks, there's an empty space, and there's Mary Folks. And the footstone allegedly belongs to Charity Folks. So 200 years after she was, in theory, forgotten to history, I placed flowers, giving her some kind of monument to mark her death and her life. Yet without a headstone to commemorate her existence, Charity's life appears as a ghost story. She's like the wandering spirits who died on board slave ships during the Middle Passage and did not have a proper burial. Charity Folks has been denied the important process of being remembered and honored by the living. She is forgotten, and because she is forgotten, she is restless. Yet as Charity Folks demonstrates, the absence of a body, or even the absence of a physical headstone, does not always equate to the absence of memory. And we are winding up because I know some of you are here on your lunch break. Even without a headstone, Charity Folks continues to draw attention to her life in interesting ways. So case in point, when I was finishing this book, you have to finish your book, you have to turn it in, you have to get tenure. The clock is not on the side of the historian. And I sent the book to the press, but I was still very unsettled. I was uncertain. So I went on an elaborate mission to track down some of her descendants. I looked on Facebook. But unfortunately, the one person I found had a Facebook account but doesn't use it. So I actually had to go the old-fashioned way and look at books, go through another historian who linked me to one of her relatives that worked in the government, who then said that she would give me this secret information once she went through the person themselves. So this is how I came to meet a woman by the name of Liberty Rashad. And Liberty Rashad is the 5 times removed granddaughter of Charity Folks. The first time we spoke was in December 2012, and the phone rang, I answered it. "Hello, Jessica, this is Liberty Rashad." And she was very dramatic and just wonderful. And she was great. And I said, "Is Liberty your real name?" "Yeah, that is my given name." I said, "Little ironic. Do you know that you're descended from a line of freedom fighters?" And so the irony was not lost on either one of us. But as we spoke about our ancestor Charity Folks, we quickly realized we were speaking about 2 different women. So for the family historians, you'll love this. I was talking about Charity Folks Sr., the mother. She was talking about Charity Folks Bishop, the daughter. There were 2 Charity Folks. And I knew this, but Liberty did not. And so that was the connection I was looking for. My academic hunch had been correct. Charity Folks had been lost to history, and she was lost to her family as well. And in one phone call, we restored not just 1 generation, but 2 generations, because I told Liberty not just about Charity Folks, but about her mother, Rachel Burke. And for a historian, this in some ways is that aha moment. This is when you get goosebumps. I mean, I have goosebumps. I don't know if you do. But this is that moment that a historian dreams of. We don't talk to people that are living and walking around in the present moment. So this was a beautiful moment. But of course, this means that Liberty has to come to Annapolis to meet me. She had never been to Annapolis. She lived in New York. She knew Annapolis was important for her family history, but she'd never been. So on Easter morning, a day of rebirth, in 2013, I met Liberty, her son, his 2 children who live in D.C., and their niece who was visiting from Chicago. And we walked all around Annapolis, and I showed them things. I showed them the dock with the Alex Haley Memorial, and we talked about how many Africans probably came through that port or lost their lives beforehand. We walked around downtown Annapolis, and I showed the grounds where Charity's house may have stood. We saw Reynolds Tavern. We saw the Banneker Douglas Museum. And as we're walking past the front of the Right Outhouse, and we're looking at it, and we're exchanging remarks about whether or not it was a tribute to 18th century Georgian architecture, or what it must have been like to be enslaved in there, someone comes from the side of the house. So Liberty looks at me, I look at her, she sends me over to the gentleman, and it turns out he was the owner of the house. I introduced myself, and Liberty started to introduce herself. I cut to the chase and said, "Listen, this is the descendant of Charity Folks." Charity Folks? So he invited us in. He invited us in through the front door. And we spent a lot of time just walking in her footsteps, looking at this garden that she probably got herbs and roots from to do some root work, looking at the time she probably, secreted herself to go to the bushes to have a safe harbor and perhaps pray. And it was this incredible experience. I had tried to get into this house so many times, but it's not open to the public. I just didn't have the right combination. I had to walk there with her descendants, and it opened right up. I haven't even gotten to the good stuff yet. So here's a picture of Liberty and myself. You can see that why some people might have said when I went traipsing around that are you a descendant of the bishops? No, have no resemblance whatsoever. This even happened in New York when I went to a church that the bishops had been ministers at. No family resemblance to my knowledge. No family relationship, rather. So Liberty and I spent 2 additional days retracing her family's past, and the trip was profound. It was blessed by the ancestors, and it exceeded our expectations. Her presence was everywhere. We felt her when we entered the John Right Outhouse. We felt her at the Banneker Douglas Museum. We actually felt her as we stood at the side of this Bank of America building that sits right on Church Circle, because that's actually where her house used to stand. So perhaps it's ironic given that she accumulated so much money. And we felt her as we entered St. Mary's Catholic Church. We snapped photos and toasted her memory. And we ended our visit at the Bishop family plot in St. Anne's Cemetery, where, of course, Liberty placed flowers honoring her ancestors, and she called out their names. As Folk's example suggests, the enslaved are persistent in their desire to be remembered. They beckon to be seen more than names and prices jotted down in plantation account books. They invite us in through artifacts, oral histories, and photos. They challenge us to engage in the untelling of narratives that neglect their pain, their suffering, and even their triumphs. Their ongoing presence forces us to deal with the flesh and blood diaspora involved in the trafficking of bodies. They call for attention, they call for atonement, they call for apologies. So how we choose to engage the past as archivists, as scholars, how we choose to engage the past then is not simply a matter of discourse. If the story of charity folks and other enslaved women is any indication, what we do matters. The story of enslaved women and Black women more generally are crucial to our understanding of the long fight for freedom. One of the ways I like to end this talk is I actually like to speak about actually what it was like to reconstruct Charity Folks' life. And part of reconstructing Charity Folks' life, it was to understand her pain. And this was a historic pain brought out of social conditions. It was a historic pain born out of social conditions, legal policies, and particular constructions that were anti-Black, anti-woman, and for the most part, anti-Black woman. Only by experiencing this pain can one truly write about and understand the redemptive and revolutionary nature of Black women's joy. As generations of Black women can attest, we know that rejoicing is the key to surviving. So in closing, I'm a lefty. That's what's going on over here. That's what's been the problem all day long. So I like to believe that Charity Folks is finding peace. She rests at the center of the family plot, surviving the ebb and flow of time, encircled by all her folk. The tombstones of her husband, her daughter, her son-in-law, and even some grandchildren bear witness to the family's enslaved past. There are other descendants that bear witness to the experiences of the family in freedom. So in this paper, Charity Folks has inhabited many forms, be it a ghost, an artifact of public memory, an enslaved woman, a free Black woman, a founding mother, and a forgotten ancestor. In each form, Charity Folks testifies to the unconquerable spirit of survival and adaptation among African Americans. Charity Folks seems to call out the past and say to us, despite it all, we are still here. Thank you. Okay, I know some of you have to leave and go back to work. We have time for a few questions, and then we'll move outside to a formal book signing. Yes, Mr. Jones.
Have you thought about going back to the cemetery and asking them to take a probe and stick it through that area where you think she might be buried?
See, that's a great idea. Yes, I don't have that kind of power, but the Library of Congress knows a lot of people. I mean, this would take, asking the family. It would take some negotiations. Yes. The answer is yes, and I'm not close to that opportunity, to that experience. I hope that at some point it will actually lead us there. Yes, in the back.
Could you speak a little bit about how her life and the choices that she was able to make so much of might have been affected by the fact that she lived in a city, and then, of course, how that might have differed had she not?
So Annapolis at this time, we can call it a city. Annapolis, by city standards, never grew to be more than just a large town. But urban centers like Annapolis, Baltimore, and Charleston, for example, people are, in some ways, that it's believed that they have more access to freedom, and that they're not on the plantation under an overseer. They've been hired out to work for someone else. Frederick Douglass talks about being almost a free man in the city. I think in Charity Folks' situation, it has been said that she probably had a degree of more freedom because the family also had a house in Whitehall, which is just past Annapolis, and it's believed she traveled back and forth to see her children. But I also want to underscore that even though she had more freedom, and even more, though enslaved people had more freedom in cities, you know, they might be able to sell their wares and use some of that money to buy their freedom. They were still enslaved. So their circumstances are conscribed in a particular manner, right? Yes, sir, in the back.
Would you like to tell us about your research in the other continents, London and Africa, Ghana?
Oh, I don't know. You all might not be ready for this. So London was London. London was London. And ma'am, I see you in the back. I'll answer your question in a minute. London was London. But there's a particular experience when you go to Africa and when you go to Ghana. I went to Ghana in particular. And because now we're all friends, I will say that I gave this paper. I gave this paper at the University of Ghana, Legon, and the instructor, who's an artist, had this great idea to put me with this backdrop of Cape Coast slave dungeon in the background. I said, yeah, I don't know if that's a good idea. But he was insistent on this because he knew the majority of enslaved people passed through Cape Coast. Okay, so there's a part in this talk where I start saying the names of the families, right? I call out their names. And that was probably one of the most beautiful memories I have of doing this kind of work. And it wasn't doing archival work, but it was literally bringing part of someone back home to the continent. And if you do African American history, that's also one of those best moments you can hope for. You can't touch it, you can't see it, but you can feel it. Yes, in the back.
I just want to say thank you. And slavery exists at this present time. We all know that. So thank you so much.
Thank you. So I think that's a good place to end. I know they're monitoring the time. So I'm going to turn the microphone back to Dr. Moses.
Please join me again in thanking Dr. Millward. Dr. Millward, you really don't know how much we have appreciated your visit and your presentation, your research, and your spirit. Your talk was so appropriate because the Humanities and Social Sciences Division, in addition to African American history, also covers women's history and local history and genealogy and American history.
I'm with it on a little.
And so for all of you, we welcome you to come in to use our resources. We have a Ask a Librarian service where you can send in your questions via the internet. We have a genealogy section where we welcome you and we can assist you with your research. And we want you to come back again. So if you do not have a reader registration card, go and get one, because the reason we have so many people here is our chief sent out something to patron services, which is when you sign up for your card to use the library, you will automatically get on this list. And so you hear about everything that's happening at the Library of Congress. We thank you again. We have, for the past couple of years, featured lectures and programs where we have starred members of the Association of Black Women Historians, of which I am a member. And it's fabulous research, it's cutting edge research, and it goes into areas that we have not visited before. So we encourage all of you here to recover someone from the past so that they will not be lost in history, okay? Our book signing will occur outside in the lobby, and she'll be available.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.